A very good evening to all. I am Lopamutra Roy from the Center for Business Innovation, ISB, and I sincerely thank you for joining today's webinar on leadership in the VUCA-BANI world. It is great to have you join in on a Thursday evening to hear out Professor Nidumolu's take on understanding and nurturing leadership skills in a VUCA-BANI world. I will take the first few minutes to quickly take you through our center and key research activities. The Center for Business Innovation is one of the youngest, yet one of the oldest research center institutes at ISB, focused on research-driven and market evidence-based business innovation, leveraging emerging technologies to facilitate organizational growth and resilience. We focus on driving business innovation and implementation through research, thought leadership, industry-academia partnership, and knowledge transfer to become an international hub for innovation from India. Our research priorities are intensively focused on GovTech innovation, with the government as the primary customer in implementing emerging technologies in their processes. We are developing an innovation index to rank tech adoption across different states based on certain parameters. We are also focused on fintech, deep diving into the evolution of payment systems in various markets and their impact on financial inclusion and the financial services industry. Our research on omnichannel marketing helps brands understand their competitive positioning to direct their strategic growth efforts across platforms. Collaborating with multiple GCCs, government, and academic bodies, we are also devising a metric to help organizations measure their innovation potential and derive actionable insights. Besides, we are deep diving our research into investigating evolving roles of corporate governance. In the energy and EV innovation sector, we focus on how digital tools and technology drive energy transformation into greener and cleaner sources. Our research on the intersection of marketing, finance, and accounting delves deeper into investigating the evolution of market-based assets that drive shareholder value. Agritech research focuses on building growth models for smart farm solutions, such as integration of fintech, financial services solution, etc. Also, our focus on healthcare innovation involves emerging business innovations in healthcare services across diagnostics, hospitals, telemedicine, and pharmaceutical parts of healthcare. Today's session will be taken by Professor Nidumolu, a professor of Organizational Behaviour Practice at ISB. Before handing the session over to Professor, I would like to quickly take you through today's agenda. In the first 10 minutes, you will be assigned to a short scenario, to read a short scenario and answer a few simple questions related to it. The next 20 minutes will be used to conduct an easy survey on understanding leadership capabilities. In the following 50 minutes, the professor will take you through the importance and understanding of leadership competencies to strengthen your organization's growth and resilience, followed by 15 minutes Q&A. I would request you to post your questions, comments, and queries in the chat box. We will address all your questions and queries at the end of the session. We appreciate your active engagement in putting up all your queries in the chat box throughout the session, and we will address them at the end. In the final 15-20 minutes of the 2-hour session, we will move you to our virtual networking rooms where you can connect and network with your co-participants. So immediately after Professor Ram's session, you will be assigned to different breakout rooms where you can network with each other. You can easily move in and out of the breakout rooms freely and conveniently to ensure maximum networking. Kindly note that the breakout room discussions will not be recorded. I'll finally stop here and request Professor Ram to take over the session.
Thank you.
Prof, the stage is all yours.
Thanks. Thank you, Lopamutra. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And let me see if I can take less than 50 minutes. But let me just set the stage. This is about leadership in a VUCA-BANI world. And again, I appreciate all of you joining this session. And this is a session organized by the Center for Business Innovation, of which I'm a part. And just to give you a quick background, I won't spend too much time. It's almost 40 years since I finished my MBA at Calcutta, at the Indian Institute of Management, Kolkata. And in those 40 years, I've spent about 20 years in academia, first as a tenure track professor, and then as a practice professor, and then 20 years in industry, as an entrepreneur, as a chief operating officer of a company in the US, and so on, and also as a consultant. So in these 40 years, something that has really helped me make the transitions between careers and also take on the challenges of entrepreneurship has been what I'll be talking about. It is an attempt to combine ancient wisdom with modern psychology and management practices. So that approach, which I call as beingfulness, is something that I'll describe. And I wrote about that about 10 years ago in a book called Two Birds in a Tree. And I'm in the process of writing a second book in this area. And I'm developing this area of what I call as beingful leadership, beingful work, and so on. So this is based on my experience with Fortune 100, 500 companies as an entrepreneur and doing research in this area, research and teaching in these areas and developing practices. There are many of these acronyms. They just keep multiplying. So I'm not going to spend too much time on these acronyms. VUCA was an acronym that came up with the US military many decades ago. BANI is a relatively new acronym developed by the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto. Then RUPT is another such acronym. TUNA is another one. They all roughly mean a sense of change, a sense of disruption. And I myself have come up with an acronym, FLAW. We are living in a 4-letter acronym world. And so the question then becomes, how do you deal with these uncertainties, these ambiguities, these disruptions, and so on? And leadership has often been the primary way in which we deal with them. And I've initiated a research project here to understand how leadership can be derived from ancient wisdom, in a sense. And for that, I've given the survey, and I'd request you to participate in it. As Lopamutra mentioned, the first 10 minutes, present a scenario to you. And then based on that scenario, there are about 20 minutes of questions that you could answer on leadership competencies. The advantage of the survey would be you then become aware of how to measure some key leadership competencies. Competencies like long-term thinking, systems orientation, having a purpose in life, self-regulation, integrity, and a few competencies that are absolutely critical in facing this kind of a disrupted world. So let me give you about 30 minutes altogether, the first 10 minutes. And if I may request Pavitra to just put a link on the chat. There we go. There's the link that you could use. The first 10 minutes, ask you to think about something in your life, a scenario that can give you more details about, a deeper way of thinking about leadership, after which there are a set of questions that actually can make you think about what is leadership ultimately about. How do you measure it? What are these capabilities and competencies that really matter? And that will set the stage for my presentation about half an hour from now. I'll talk about these competencies. They're central to beingful leadership, but by then you'd have a sense of how to measure them. Please go ahead and take some time and just going through scenarios, click on that link. And if there are any problems, please let Pavitra know. She's there as, just type in, when you do the two, Pavitra Madhira, Pavitra Madhira. But please go ahead. Again, I want to emphasize participation here is voluntary. You're not required to do so. This is a research project conducted by ISP. Therefore, the participation is voluntary. I encourage you, nevertheless, to participate. We'll give you some insights on leadership and how to measure leadership. The intent of this effort is to create indigenous models of leadership that draw from ancient wisdom as well as modern psychology and leadership practices. Many of these scales used for measuring critical leadership concepts are well established in the academic literature and can be used by anyone. They've been shown to be very valid. And for those of you who've been joining in just now, there's a link which you can click upon. And once you click on it, it'll take you to a study on leadership, which we call as beingful leadership. It describes a scenario to you, and then it asks you to look at some of these leadership practices or competencies and to assess yourself. And by the way, this survey is anonymous. You don't have to disclose your name, so you can be frank and forthright in answering this survey. You're welcome to take screenshots of this if you want to later on know how to assess these competencies. In this research, there are some beliefs we'll ask you about. You don't have to believe in them. You may not believe in them at all, and that's quite fine. So you can indicate that this is something you don't believe in at all. For those of you joining in now, there's a link in your chat box. Please click on that chat box, on that link, which will take you to a research survey where you'll be asked some questions on some scenarios and then some leadership competencies. And the participation is voluntary, but the goal of this research is to develop some indigenous models of leadership and to understand how beliefs may influence orientations and these behaviors associated with leadership. Is there any connection at all? That's what we're trying to study. They're all self-reported, all anonymous. So please be as forthright and honest as you can. None of us can trace the response to any one of you. Hopefully the questions are thought-provoking, and they are widely established in the field of leadership research. The link is given in the chat box. I don't know if you can see it, but in the chat box itself, the link is given. We'll just, there we go. It's been copied.
Professor, just a quick word. It might help to reshare the link because I think some of the people who have joined late may not see that.
Oh, okay, so
I think Pavitra has just shared. So yeah, I
yes,
think it's just come.
There we go.
Perfect. All right. Thank you,
you,
Prof.
And is that Mohit that was just speaking? Okay.
Yeah, that was me.
Okay, I can recognize your voice. There we go.
Thank you, Prof.
I think, you may have been disconnected, and I guess you're joining back again. And just a note for you, we did not name these competencies so that it would not bias you in any particular way, but you can take a guess at what they're about. And as Lopamutra just indicated in the chat box, please click on the link and it'll take you to a research survey on leadership. And the survey is about understanding beliefs and how they might affect competencies, leadership competencies. And some of these competencies, almost all of them, are very well established in the literature. And there are well-established scales for measuring them, which you could use too in your organization. These scales are called Likert scales because they're looking at your attitudes and your subjective judgments. Let me give you another 15 minutes to finish the survey. Hopefully the questions are thought-provoking and not difficult to answer. Let me give you another 10 minutes to complete the survey. I hope it's going well and these questions are understandable at least. Yes, it is too long. I do apologize for that. Ali, that's very true. It is long and does need a lot of thinking. Absolutely. But I'm hoping that also means it was thought-provoking for you. Let me give you another 7 minutes. We'll finish at 6:40 IST. Natali, I'm glad you liked the survey. Hopefully the questions will give you a sense of what the leadership competencies are about. Could you guess what they were about? You don't need to disclose, but okay. And these are the competencies especially needed in this VUCA-BANI rupt tuna kind of world. In this flawed world, I guess, FLA, 4-letter acronymed world. One way to think about these questions is not to spend too much time thinking about them, but to respond in terms of your top of your mind, which often can just be an immediate gut feel about them. Let me give you 5 more minutes, and then we'll move on to the leadership discussion. And I'll present you a model of leadership that draws on these competencies and these beliefs. Thank you, Krishnamurthy. Thank you for that. I hope it was informative for you.
Yes, so it is a good, but I don't want to disturb the others who are seriously filling the survey. So I will wait.
Well, as long as you found it helpful, that's wonderful.
Yes, good.
Yes, Ramana, you can just copy. You can just take a screenshot or send us an email. We'll send you a copy of the survey questions. Not a problem. Okay, thank you all very much for participating in this research. My apologies again for this being long. And there were some questions asked in terms of a copy of the survey. If you were to send an email to Lopamudra, for example, or any of the CBI, Center for Business Innovation team, then they'll pass on your email, and we'll be happy to send you a copy of the survey. In terms of the results, because it's anonymous, you won't know specific to your response, because we won't know who you are. But our goal is to do an analysis of about 500 responses once we get them, which we expect in the next couple of months. So we need a large sample size for making any conclusions. So 2 months from now, we hope to have that kind of a sample size. And please send an email if you want the results. These will be aggregate results, which we'll then send to you. The initial analysis we'll send to you after we've got that sample size, as I mentioned, about 2 months or so from now. That's what we hope. And please send your request right here. Yes, there's Lopamudra's email, Lopamudra_Roy. And again, so what this whole study was about is about some core beliefs.
Sorry, if I can request something.
Yeah,
I think our email IDs are already there with the organizer. So you want us to retype the email ID?
Just send a message here on chat to Lopamudra saying, please send a survey. So she'll get it, and then she'll compare. Is that fine, sure. Lopamudra? Or just, even better, just send an email to Lopamudra_Roy@isb.edu. So that's much easier.
Okay.
Please go send an email saying, send me a copy of the survey, and she'll then pass it. She'll aggregate and pass it on to me. Okay.
Okay.
So just as background, the goal of that research, which I'll then build upon in this presentation, is how do our beliefs shape, and in particular, how do our core beliefs shape our orientation to the world, orientation to our companies, to the colleagues we have, and how does that in turn shape our behaviors? So that's what we're studying there. And there's a particular kind of leadership we are developing here at ISB called beingful leadership. And I'll describe what that leadership is about in the next 40 minutes. But before that, very quickly, just in a minute or so, what are the most important challenges that you're facing currently in your work, so that I can understand where you're coming from and not presume what your challenges are. Please go ahead and type in. It'll also be helpful for others to know the challenges that you're facing. What are the top 2 or 3 challenges that you're facing at work? Challenges related to innovation, whatever comes to the top of your mind. Okay. Employee engagement, developing a new revenue stream, ensuring high ethical standards. Absolutely. Managing between different generations. And it's turning out that these generations also have, sub-generations. Even though it takes about 15 years to separate a generation, even if someone is 5 years younger than you or older than you, there's a difference in perspective. Intolerance and resistance, leadership development, fast-changing supplier environment. Okay. And Sandeep, as you pointed out, that tension between compassion and performance. Aligning people, absolutely. Feeling connected with the workplace. Digital transformation, very interesting. And in this presentation, I won't be able to address all of them clearly, but what I will try to do is address that common challenge of motivation and alignment. How do you motivate yourself? How do you motivate your team? And how do you align you and your team? So I'll just focus on that, on motivation. And as part of that, let me define leadership as really inspiring and empowering. That's what motivation is about, to inspire them, empower them, your people and your resources. To do what? To create a context. So it's not about micromanaging your employees, your team members, but it is creating the context in which they can flourish. Flourish in what way? By creating radically new possibilities for them, new opportunities, new possibilities. And recognizing what are the constraints. So there is a context that's being disrupted, whether it's volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, or whatever term it may be, that there is a disruption going on in your context. And so given that disruption, how do you create new possibilities that will motivate, in particular, inspire and empower your people and the resources they bring? So that's how I see as define as leadership. It is about the extraordinary. It's not about doing ordinary things. Doing ordinary things comes naturally to us. So in that sense, leadership is normative, not just descriptive, but normative, what it ought to be, as opposed to the kinds of leadership we typically see. So it's really about doing something different. And in order to understand that, there's a lot to be said in ancient wisdom on doing something extraordinary, particularly in terms of motivation. And I don't want to just focus on ancient Indian wisdom. It's wisdom that was common to ancient India, ancient Greece, ancient Mesopotamia, ancient China, and so on, which gave rise to many of the great religions of the world. And this verse from the Upanishads illustrates that kind of commonality. This is something that has been interpreted in their own ways by different religions, different civilizations. And even if you're a scientist at heart, if you are, for example, an atheist at heart, this verse can be reinterpreted by you. And let me just quickly ask, what does this verse mean in the context we're talking about, which is leadership in terms of motivation, motivational leadership? Any thoughts on that? Please use the chat, and then I'll quickly summarize what this verse is about. What is the tree, and who are these two dear friends? And again, I want to emphasize, even though this verse appears in the Upanishads, the content of it, the underlying core of it, is not specific to the Upanishads. It was actually shared wisdom across multiple civilizations. Sanjay, yes, what is our mind, though? When you say mind, is all of it the mind? Okay, Chaitali, you would say same experiences but different perspectives. So I'll expand on Sanjay's approach. Chaitali, you're onto the right track in terms of experiences, but there's some key things missing in both the answers. Anyone else? Okay, so let me just quickly, so the tree is supposed to be our body, motivation. And Prashant, as you point out, one aspect of it, there are two aspects to, or two kinds of self, you could argue. There is the ego self, or the mind-body complex, as it's called. And then there is the witness self. And, you know, the different, Freud saw it as the ego and the superego, or the conscience. The ancient Greeks thought of it as the physical self and the eudaimon, E-U-D-A-I-M-O-N, which is the good soul. Christians saw it as your human soul, and then your Godhead in you, your eternal soul. In Sufism, there is the notion of a friend, the internal friend who's there for you, the eternal friend. In Buddhism, which influenced China and Japan and the Far East, that the one that watches silently and compassionately is often called the Buddha nature, Tathagata Garbha. And if you're a scientist, or if you're an atheist, more specifically, and you believe in none of these things, you don't believe in a soul, you don't believe in a spirit, all that you believe in is the empirical self, the physical self, which is the one that eats the fruit in anxious greed, then the one that watches silently is the power of reason, the power of rational reason, rationality, or pure reason, as it's called. So really, these are two kinds of experiences. One is an experience involving the ego, which is all about action and doing. The other is anchored in a quieter place, in a larger perspective, You can almost say looking at the system as a whole, looks at the world as a whole. And that's not just you, but the people you interact with. And that one is anchored not in doing, but in being, existence, pure existence. So you can often see this as the sort of the trade-off between, or the balance between doing and being. So if you're anchored in doing, then it's all about chasing deadlines, working hard towards your KPIs, making sure that you hit your numbers. Your performance bonus becomes important if you're an entrepreneur. Then hitting your goals, your milestones that your board of directors give to you or your customers want from you, that becomes critical. And the great anxiety and the ups and downs that go with activity. And then the one that watches silently and compassionately, that's important, is the one that takes some time for reflection, that looks at your core values, that is less oriented to doing, but much more towards what does this all mean? What does your activity mean? What do your relationships mean? So it's a much bigger picture. Often these are depicted as being at different levels of the tree, the lower bird and the higher bird. But it's important to keep in mind that there are two ways of being, two ways of experiencing. And so I'm just going to spend some time on that. And that's what I define as beingfulness. It's a way of life where you seek to fully express that witness self or your being. How do you express it? Through that ego self or doing, with what purpose in mind? To restore internal and external wholeness. Emphasizes wholeness within you and wholeness outside of you. So really seeing doing, seeing your activity as a way to express your core values, your way of being, to see it as a full expression, a natural self-expression of really what you think your true self is, what your core self is. There's no way to pin it down, but whatever you feel is your core you, being able to express it fully through your action, but with a goal in mind, and that is internal and external wholeness. That's how I define this concept of beingfulness. And I'm just going to quickly, for those of you trained in mindfulness, let me just ask, who here is familiar with mindfulness or perhaps trained in it or knows a great deal about it? Anyone here who's experienced in mindfulness? Okay. So really the way to distinguish between them is mindfulness. Abhay, you're in mindfulness. Okay. Okay, two beings can behave differently. Absolutely, Abhay. So yes, this notion of being is particular to you. And it's through your activities that you behave differently. Your activities and the way you are in the world, the way you manifest yourself is different from others. But these are the core differences between mindfulness and beingfulness. Mindfulness is very much about the changing nature of the world. That's the reality of the world. Everything changes. That's a core belief of mindfulness. Beingfulness, which is derived from these other ancient wisdom traditions I was talking about, there is the notion of a steady something that's steady in you, a witness in you, and that's often called the higher self. So there is a core part of you that remains steady. Mindfulness is all about being in the present moment. Beingfulness is awareness across time, past, present, and future. So in a way, your life story matters a great deal. How you tell your life story, how you are across time, the meaning you derive across time makes a big difference. So this is the difference between zooming in into the present moment and zooming out to see your life as a whole, and also to see the system as a whole. So beingfulness is very much about the whole system in which you're embedded. It might be your supplier ecosystem. It might be your value chain. It might be your ecosystem of your partners. So looking at that system, and gradually increasing the scope of that system, keeping that in mind, undertaking systems thinking in a way. That's what beingfulness is about. Mindfulness is about non-judgmental acceptance, accepting what happens, what comes to you in a non-judgmental way. And beingfulness is about being a change agent, to see yourself as creating those extraordinary possibilities I was talking about. So that's the core difference between mindfulness and beingfulness. Three main differences: the notion of the higher self, the notion of the whole, as the system as a whole, and you being a change agent. And with that, you can lead to the definition of beingful leadership. These are the principles, beliefs, and behavior is a very important part of it. Leadership is not just about beliefs, It's about beliefs, behaviors, the underlying principles, and the capabilities. And so what you saw in that survey identifies some of those beliefs, the most important capabilities. And these capabilities were things like systems thinking. It was like long-term orientation, having a purpose in life and at work, having a sense of self-regulation, being able to master yourself, and also integrity. Integrity is a very important capability, often expressed as a behavior, and that's called behavioral integrity. So these are what you saw in the survey are the components of beingful leadership. With that, let me just stop here. This is quite a bit of concepts. Let me stop here to make sure the concepts make sense, and then I'll make it clearer in terms of how do these principles manifest themselves. But before that, any questions? Yes, Mohit, mindfulness is short-term in the sense that it recognizes the transient nature of everything. Everything changes in mindfulness, and being at peace with it and non-judgmentally accepting that change. That's the core of mind. Any questions on this? Let me ask if, Ami, does this make sense to you? Any questions?
Yeah, this makes sense.
And what about it makes sense to you? How would you put it in your own words?
So as a leader, you don't only have to be like, set, but you have to change. And yeah, so you need to keep evolving yourself as an individual, personally and professionally.
Absolutely. And but you also need to have that core that doesn't change, right? Those core values. In some ways, I want to go back to this verse here. Sorry, this verse here.
So your principles don't change, but with
Absolutely.
situations, you need to
Absolutely.
keep up.
Absolutely. You can think of it as a hurricane or a storm. There's a
Yes.
lot of activity, but the eye of the hurricane, the eye of the storm is very still. And those are your core principles and values. So having something in you that stays steady, but then you're very adaptable in terms of the activity or the doing part. Manju, does this make sense to you?
Yes, Professor, to some extent, I would say I'm still getting I think mindfulness, I did have some understanding, but beingfulness, I'm hearing it for the first time, can relate
Absolutely.
to a lot of things, but I think a good bit of that is learning.
Absolutely. And that's what I'm going to explain in more detail. And which part of it do you relate to? Which part of it does make sense to you or is it relatable to you?
I think both are relatable. But of course, maybe that I'd say I knew more about mindfulness than beingfulness. So I'm curious to know.
Absolutely. And that's what I'll spend some time explaining how it translates in practice, how it works in practice. And as Ramana pointed out, yes, coming back to that illustration, you need to, and perhaps not necessarily alternately, because there's a part of you that could be observant, and there's another part of you that is responding to the situation. We can do both. We have the ability to have two simultaneous ways of being in ourselves. In fact, we do it all the time. There's a part of us that is still, there's a part of it that's changing all the time, there's a part of it that is looking at the big picture, there's a part of it that's zeroing in. So we have that ability. And in fact, our left brain is very different from our right brain, but yet they get integrated to give us a sense of one whole brain. So with that, so let me just spend some time then on how these differences manifest themselves. First of all, it's important that there be a balance between the two, right? So effective leadership is creating a balance. Of course, it's your sense of balance. There's no rule, universal rule on what balance is about. There are no numbers you can give to it, but you know it through your well-being. If you're feeling well internally and externally, then there is a balance going on. So well-being directly is connected with balance. We already have that in our body. We have what's called the homeostatic balance, where the chemicals in the body, our blood pressure, sugar levels, our vitamin levels. When we do a blood test, for example, we test for a number of markers, and they need to be within a particular range. And that's what a balanced individual is. If they go out of range or out of balance, then we have a health issue. So in that sense, that notion of balance is already deeply in our DNA. And it's that balance between knowing and doing that leads to well-being. So let's talk of, let me call the doing part the constrained self. Constrained because it is seeing a smaller picture. It's more driven by self-interest, and it's driven by what it is seeing around it, outcomes, right? That's a constrained self is all about knowing about leadership. The expanded self is the witness self. And as I mentioned, you can think of it figuratively as being at the top of the tree. It has a bird's eye view. It does more systems thinking. It does more long-term thinking. And that expanded self, most importantly, also includes others. It's not just about self-interest, it also includes other interest in others. And that is more about not just knowing about leading, but about showing up as a leader, being a leader, the way you act, the way you are. So it's a notion of being or are, and you are a leader in that sense. The constrained self is more about learning by telling. The expanded self is more about leading by example, leading by showing. Constrained self often is a victim, sees itself as a victim of its circumstances. The expanded self takes an ownership orientation, sees itself as an agent of change. Very importantly, the constrained self sees the world around it as a fixed pie. And therefore, you start maximizing what you can get and minimize what others can get. What's called a zero-sum game. You play a zero-sum game when you interact with people. The expanded self is thinking in terms of creating win-wins for everyone or growing the pie. What's also called a non-zero-sum game. Notice, again, there's nothing saying that you must be only the expanded self. Both are necessary. In certain settings, you may need to play that fixed pie, especially if the other person is not cooperating, is not reciprocating or trustworthy. So both kinds of ways of being will be needed. You can't just be one or the other. The constrained self is all about inspecting, looking at ideas in the context of innovation, at some level, looking at ideas from an inspection viewpoint, shooting bullets at it, trying to find holes in the idea, trying to at some level pull the idea down to see if it will withstand these criteria you have. The expanded self is much more about exploring. The constrained self is about a fixed mindset, staying firm, not changing. The expanded self is about a growth mindset. Certain instances, yes, you may need to be rigid. And certain instances, especially now in a disrupted world, a growth mindset would be critical. But you have both ways of being in a way. One is a doing way, the other is more a reflective way of being. The constrained self is all about the daily grind. The expanded self sees it as a field of play. So it's the balance between these two different ways of being in the world that leadership is about, according to Beingful Leadership, right? And I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but here are the principles that guide the constrained self. So you learn through concepts and examples. You communicate this learning to others through telling them. You assume that your context is largely given to you, that you can't change it. If, for example, you're a leader who feels that senior executives are the ones who created the problem, or junior people who report to you are the problem, then it's a sense of limited agency. You are a victim of the setup in your company. And you see all possibilities are subject to constraints. You also think in terms of ideas need to be seen for completeness. So you emphasize, for example, the ROI on the idea at the early stages itself. You emphasize, for example, is this giving a business return at the very early stage of the idea? You're looking for completeness of evidence. You're also expecting ideas to be proven. Failure is a problem. You sort of see it as we have to reduce the risk in these ideas. So failure is not an option. In a sense, you're looking for perfection. And of course, leadership you see as very hard, political, stressful. Again, all these could be true in settings, but the opposite could also be true. That you may change the way you look at it, where you see leadership as being a leader, leading by example. You see leadership as you have agency over your context, you can change it. That any context is based on your attitude towards it. You can change your attitude, and that when you change the context, you create new possibilities. And when someone suggests an idea to you, a team member comes up with an idea, then you see yourself as someone who's co-creating that idea with that person. So you contribute to the idea, you make it more robust, then you subject it to the test, not right away, but you see yourself as co-creating an idea. And you believe that growth takes place, you evolve mainly through trial and error. And therefore, Mistakes are an opportunity for learning. And finally, you see this as an opportunity for play and fun, having fun. Of course, it's not easy. It is stressful, but you see the fun side of the play that this field of leadership gives you. So that's how principles, those are the driving principles. And let me just stop here at this stage and ask if there are any questions on these driving principles. Then I'll give you some scenarios, but any questions on the principles of the constrained self, the two ways of being in the world as a leader. I again want to emphasize both are needed. It's a balance between the two. Tirath, does this make sense to you?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Is it motivated by our personal prejudices?
Yes, the constrained self is very motivated by personal prejudices. It's driven by our personal prejudices. Hopefully, the expanded self is less driven by it because it has the ability, if you have the ability to become more self-aware, be able to distance yourself from that ego part of you, then you are likely, again, you can never bring your prejudices or your biases down to zero. That's very difficult. But hopefully you've reduced it by this ability to be self-aware, by understanding others, and being able to distance yourself from your ego, and being aware of your prejudices, your biases, to know that you may have an overconfidence streak in you, that you're subject to overconfidence. So it can be reduced in the expanded self, but in the constrained self, you're driven by those prejudices and their biases, right? There's a subtle difference between prejudice and cognitive bias, but yes, in the constrained self, you're subject to both of them.
And as a leader, I need to evaluate others also.
Absolutely.
So how do we strike the balance between the constrained self and expanded self?
Right. So let's
some people work immediately and they look very active, whereas some people will be a bit slow to take off. So
yes. Yeah. So the first responsibility of this leadership is first understand yourself, self-awareness. But then the other very important responsibility is understand others. What you describe. First impressions are not necessarily the lasting impressions, right? So some people seem slow, but turn out to be perhaps deep thinkers. Some people seem fast, but turn out to be surface, glib thinkers in a way. So yeah, you do need that patience and persistence, and the ability to be a coach. It's very critical. So the expanded self sees itself as a coach. You see yourself as a coach to your team, which means you are reducing your biases towards your team. You're training your team members. You're giving them constructive feedback. Coaching is a very important part of the expanded self. So it's going beyond yourself. Manju, go ahead, please.
So, Professor, when we are talking about leadership, and leadership has existed all through.
Yes.
And are we saying that, so mindful leadership in itself is being conscious about things and the decisions that you make, or how you understand yourself as a leader. And with beingful leadership, it is, so are we saying that this is an evolution from the different?
Yeah, so yes, it is an evolution beyond mindful. Mindful leadership is very important. And mindful leadership is very much about being very aware of yourself, right? The prejudices you have, just to draw on the earlier comment, and how you respond judgmentally to situations, becoming aware of it, so you become less judgmental, being very conscious of the moment, conscious of the world, conscious of what's happening in the moment, right? But you can evolve beyond it by also integrating the moment with your past history and your future hopes. So that's one big part of beingful leadership. You're stretching across time and not just in the moment. You're also expanding the scope of who you are, not just about you, but also all the others you interact with, seeing them as a system. So being very aware of that and your role in that system. That's very important, that ability to detach from yourself and see how you're connected to the others and how you shape the others, are impacted by the others. That's the other part of it, right? And then a third part of it is very much in terms of having a sense of purpose. So mindfulness doesn't emphasize purpose much. Beingfulness is very driven by purpose because meaning is driven by purpose. So beingfulness really emphasizes meaning. And one of the best ways to have meaning is having a sense of purpose. So purpose is all future-oriented. So that's a big part of beingfulness. Having a sense of purpose for yourself, your team, and your organization. And when you have a sense of purpose, you become a change agent. You're driving to achieve that purpose. So that's what makes you very like an agent, someone who can make things happen. And therefore, yes, the answer to your question is yes, it's a further evolution in consciousness. It's an expansion of your consciousness, right? Across time, across people, and across things like purpose. Chaitali, go ahead, please.
So Ram just had a question. This whole sense of having purpose
Yes.
is not just in connection to the future, it's also in connection to the past, isn't it? Of who I am. Because when we are saying beingfulness, two exactly similar people with similar backgrounds could actually have the same purpose for the future. But our connection with our past and how we projectile ourselves literally will decide how the beingful for both of us is going to be different.
Absolutely. And I want to actually draw the distinction between happiness and meaning. Happiness is very much in the present. A lot of the psychology research suggests happiness is very much in the moment, in the present. Looking at the past, what you described is a great source of meaning. Meaning is very much about, you may have had a terrible experience in the past, a terrible thing. You may look at it now and say, that was really important to me. I am who I am because of that experience. It may have been bad then, but it's, I look back at it very fondly. Perhaps it might have been your biggest learning experience, and that is meaning. So in some ways, if you have the same purpose, two people have the same purpose, how they go about it, the meaning they derive from it is very dependent on their past, as you mentioned. Your past shapes you very much. There's that famous line. That famous line talks about the past was never the past. It was never dead. Well, it's actually, what is that line? Those of you may remember it. The past is not even the past. It is never dead, right? So that's absolutely right. The past is always present and shapes your future. Okay, and Ramesh, you asked a question. How do we manage the self to manage? That's, of course, the $1 million question, or the 800 crore rupee question. But yes, I will get to it. Let me see if I can get to it. Yes, I do. So I do have a process for how to become a beingful leader. And the self-regulation is the most critical part and the most difficult part of it, because it is all about managing your ego, managing your impulses, managing your desires. And no wonder ancient wisdom really emphasized self-regulation. Across all, Stoicism in ancient Greece, and of course the Vedanta in India, all religions emphasize this sense of self-regulation, not to give in to the constrained self. It's not easy. What I have is something, I'll get to that in a few minutes. Let me actually quickly get to that. But yes, that is a key challenge of beingfulness. How do you manage the ego, the constrained self, so it doesn't take over, it doesn't take you up and down with its emotions? Any other questions before I quickly describe an example where you could work with the expanded self? Any questions? Okay, with that, Mohit, go ahead, please.
Yeah, Prof, my question was more on the application part of this shift, right?
Yes.
I mean, if you were to look at a practical leader in any industry or a sector,
absolutely,
the empirical day-to-day routine that is there that we observe through all of our experiences, it doesn't really involve a lot of conditioning that beingfulness needs. Where you participate in a lot of other activities, you are mindful of so many things.
Yes.
So what's your opinion about that shift? Like a real fast-paced world versus a very beingful world, which
you're
kind of has
absolutely right. You're right
paradox.
That the pace of the world we're in is all about doing an activity. But the thing is, every such occasion, every decision you make, every interaction you have, every activity you participate in is an opportunity. It's the question of how do you see that opportunity? And let me actually, it's a good segue into this example. So typically when we interact with others, let me just take the case of entrepreneurship. Many of you are entrepreneurs here, right? And I've been for many years an entrepreneur. I think about 15 years of entrepreneurship across 3 companies that I founded and ran. So what I learned is a very important one. If I'm operating from the constrained self, if I'm very powerful, let's say I'm dealing with an investor, right? Trying to get money into the company. And let's say I'm a very powerful entrepreneur and investors want to really invest in the company, then I might just take a me first attitude. I take whatever and I don't really, I'll give you a little bit of some scraps, for example. And that's a me first attitude. It's also very common in leadership. If you're a very powerful leader, there's a big difference between you and your team members. You basically lay down the law. It's all about you. You don't really care about what others want and think and so on. That used to be effective many years ago, less and less effective now. Another way to look at your interactions with others is a win-lose. We will negotiate, and every activity you undertake is a negotiation. We'll negotiate, but I'll try to win as much as possible, and you will try to win as much as possible. It becomes a win-lose, right? You're tugging, like a tug of war. That's a win-lose. And if you are an enlightened, constrained bird as a leader or as an entrepreneur, let's take the example of an entrepreneur. You'll say, okay, let's find the sweet spot between what you want as an investor and what I want as an entrepreneur. And if you're a leader in a business setting, you're not an entrepreneur, then you'll try to find the sweet spot between what you want and what perhaps the other person wants, your partner wants, your stakeholders want. So you're looking for a win-win. And win-win is often called the sweet spot. All this is great. It's much better. Sweet spot, win-win approach is much better than the other two. And everything that we do is an opportunity to find the sweet spot. But this is still very constrained. And let me just quickly ask, what is constrained about? Amit, that's absolutely the line. The past is never dead. It isn't even the past, right? Absolutely. And so what is the problem with this approach? It's, again, much better than win, lose, and me first. But there's nevertheless a constraint, which is why I call it as part of the constrained bird or the constrained self. Mohit, you asked the question, what do you think is the problem with this approach? What's limited about this approach, which we confront every time and every decision we make? What's your sense? And open it up to others also. What is the challenge in this approach? Anyone?
I can just...
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Manju.
Yeah.
Was it Manju who's asking? Yeah, go ahead, Manju. Sorry, who was responding?
Yeah, I was going to say something, but I think somebody was...
Sorry, Ami, go ahead. Ami, go ahead.
Yeah. So one challenge we can face is sometimes we are unaware of what is actually in our interest or isn't.
Absolutely. We've seen that
so
repeatedly.
We are not...
Yeah,
there is lack of clarity as to what will work for us or what won't.
And we often see it as, thank God what I wanted didn't work out, right? Something better worked out.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yes. That's one. Because we may not be very clear about our interests. What else is the problem? Chaitali, go ahead, please.
So, Prof, three things come to my mind. One is, of course, what Ami said, the sense of lack of awareness. Sometimes it is just lost into action and self-interest, which is so strong, and we just feel that it is a do or die kind of a situation.
And let me just build on that. Sorry, go ahead. Finish
and the last one, I think, is the whole sense of accomplishment or victory, the way it's defined. It is so outward focused that it just seems that that's the right thing to do.
Okay. So in some ways you're missing, right? Yeah, you may, because of your blinding self-interest, overwhelming self-interest, you might miss out. Manju, what's your sense of what's the problem with this sweet spot, win-win?
I think getting the other interest component, the other party also into an agreement to be in the sweet spot.
Yeah, no, and yes, and notice just from those words, the space, notice the area here. What you're agreeing upon is still smaller than the whole, right? All said and done, it is a compromise. It is a compromise. By its very definition, it's a compromise. If I want something, you want something, just the part that overlaps is actually much smaller. So there's a better way to think of it, where you don't necessarily need to compromise. And that's what's called a non-zero sum game. You're actually growing the whole pie. And you're not thinking in terms of the pie is fixed, and let's come to terms with how much percentage I get as an entrepreneur, how much you get as an investor. In my first startup, those are the battles I fought. I spent half my time really wasting it on those kinds of battles. A better way to think about it is, can you together with this other person and other players, other stakeholders grow the whole pie. So you're less obsessed about what percentage you get, but you're really thinking in terms of growing the whole pie itself. So that solution, that creative solution, again, I want to remind you of that, the leadership as creating extraordinary possibilities. Those possibilities might be much bigger than what in your limited way we're coming up with. All said and done, this is a compromise solution. But if you think in terms of getting a group of people really brainstorming and identifying what could be an even bigger pie, there's tremendous potential there. So of course, it requires the other person also to play with you, right? To think similarly. But if that is possible, if you can get the other person to realize that you are watching out for his or her interests also, then you can actually grow the whole system, the whole non-zero sum. So as a result, the value of what you're creating can be much bigger than in the compromise situation. All said and done, this is just a compromise. And if this can come together, and we'll discuss how to bring it together, you might create a whole new possibility. And that's what entrepreneurship is all about, creating radically new possibilities between investors, entrepreneurs who typically are loggerheads with each other, and others who invest in the company, employees who often are loggerheads with the founder of the company. So getting all these stakeholders to work together to create a growing pie. And that's the expanded way of thinking. So the question is, how do you do it, right? As a concept, it may make sense, but how do you do it? How do you actually create those kinds of possibilities? And I'm going to just quickly, in about 10 minutes, just summarize the how. There's a lot more to it, but let me just quickly summarize the how. First, think in terms of different levels. There's a whole system, but think of that system as comprising subsystems. Level 1 is all the strategic side of it. Level 2 is the business processes, the team leadership, and the culture. Essentially, level 2 is about interpersonal. Level 3 is about the individual's mindset and the individual's sense of self, right? Beginning with you, beginning very much with you. And also to think of it as a journey. It will take some time to develop these competencies. And many of the competencies I described in that survey you did were part of this, right? Competencies that you develop in that survey could lead to progress on this journey. First and most important competency is self-awareness. Spending time understanding yourself and your sense of purpose. Often it's not clear because we're always caught up in activity. But making sure you have the time, making sure you can reflect, allows you to become more self-aware. And let me give you the high level, and then I'll give you details of each of them. Second, and equally important, is understanding others, and that's empathy. Third, and perhaps the most difficult, is self-regulation. The question that was asked earlier by Ramesh Akalla. How do you manage your ego? That is all about self-regulation. And fourth, and very importantly, is integrity. And integrity, self-regulation, these are all questions that were asked in the survey. There are measures for them. How do you measure them? They are indeed measurable. Now, let me just quickly show how can you develop these. Many experiences can give you self-awareness. Let me just show you Satya Nadella's experience. As you know, he's the CEO of Microsoft, born 1967. So he's now about 56 years old, 3 children, one of whom passed away last year, March. Zain, his eldest, passed away last year, March. And here's Satya Nadella talking about
your first child was born with cerebral palsy. He is now 21 years old. So how did you realize that was going to change your life, and how have you dealt with that issue?
Yeah, even I was 29 years old when Zain, our son, was born, and if you had even asked me maybe even an hour before he was born what was going through my head, it was all about, oh, is the nursery going to be ready? What's going to happen to our weekends now we have a son? And when will Anu, my wife, get back to a job, and so on. But obviously everything changed that night. He was born because of an undetected in utero distress, asphyxiation, with severe brain damage, and that led to cerebral palsy, and he's quadriplegic now. The first, I would say, David, maybe even 2 years or more even, I was more about, like, why did this happen to me? What happened to us? And all of these plans that I had are now all been thrown up in the air and changed. When Whereas Anu, my wife, what came naturally to her as a mother was, she said, okay, I'm not going back to my job. I'm going to really care for my son, drive him around for therapy after therapy. And I watched that. Without schooling me, I got schooled. That nothing happened to me. What happened was to my son, and that it was time for me to understand that, realize that, see life through his eyes, and then do my duty as a father. That, to me, perhaps, didn't come in one moment. It's something that I think took time. But as I figured it out, it changed me, both as obviously a parent, but also who I am today and how I approach everything.
So notice, these are moments, experiences. Yes, in this case, it was a tragic experience, but there are many experiences like this that can be opportunities for learning, and learning what particularly, how to move from a victim mindset to an ownership mindset. And that's a very important part of self-awareness. In this case, he saw himself as the victim. For 2 years, he felt he was the victim. Really, he was not the victim, his son was the victim. And it took time for him to recognize he now needed to become an owner of this problem. So in that sense, self-awareness goes hand in hand with this realization that I have agency, that I'm not the victim. I feel that's the first and biggest change in leadership. You're on the path to that kind of extraordinary possibility creation if you really see yourself as an agent of change. But it's not enough to see yourself as an agent of change, that you have ownership. You also have to have empathy, understanding others. And that's really what, I'm just going to quickly skip this. That's what empathy is about, how to understand others.
Your son lives with you now.
Yes.
And one of the qualities that you say you got from all this was empathy, and that the result of having empathy made you a better CEO and a better person. Is that fair?
Yeah, in fact, when I look at empathy, and most people think empathy is just something that you reserve, for your life and your family and your friends or what have you. But the reality is, I think it's an existential priority for a business. Because if you look at it, like, what is our business? Our business is to meet unmet, unarticulated needs of customers. There is no way our innovation to meet unmet, unarticulated needs is going to come about if we don't listen. Not just listen to the words, but go deep to understand what the needs are behind it. So I think empathy is core to innovation. And life's experience, if you listen and you learn from, teaches you. I wouldn't claim, as I've sort of even talked about it, with any innate capability of empathy that I was born with. If anything, it's life that has taught me. And if anything, my pursuit is every year, is there growing sense of empathy for people around me?
And that's the value of empathy. It gives you a deep understanding of the other person's point of view. It is an acquired competency. It's not a trait. It's something you can acquire, like self-awareness. And it's different from sympathy. Sympathy is feeling the way others feel. Empathy is understanding the way you think and the way you look at the world. Empathy is at least required. If you can be sympathetic, even better, but sympathy can lead to subjective biases coming in. Empathy at least maintains the objectivity. But yes, it's a critical leadership competency, increasingly extremely critical in a world that's changing rapidly. But to ensure self-awareness and empathy, self-control or self-regulation is absolutely critical. I've seen this over and over again in successful leaders. This is something that ancient wisdom repeatedly emphasizes. Psychology research has really come to the view that this is very, very critical, self-regulation. In my experience, the best way to develop self-regulation is what I call as daily meds. It's hard, it'll take several years in one sense, but I've found that these practices of meditation, exercise, watching your diet, ensuring you get good sleep, things you do outside of work, and especially cultivating a special hobby. It could be music, it could be gardening, it could be, some particular games that you like, those that are soothing and relaxing. Reading, of course, is a wonderful one. So these special hobbies, combined with meditation, exercise, diet, and restful sleep, these are very critical in self-regulating yourself. And they lead to greater concentration, productivity, creativity, all those things at work. And I've personally experienced it That's again something ancient wisdom emphasized repeatedly. Self-regulation is the master key to the kind of control of the ego that was asked earlier, that Ramesh asked about. Because it is in a way ensuring that the constrained self or the lower bird doesn't overwhelm you. You don't get completely consumed by grief and become depressed and so on, right? And finally comes behavioral integrity, and I'll end with that. Integrity is all about, well, there are two aspects to integrity: moral integrity, which is about honesty. Unfortunately, honesty is a trait. It's very difficult to become honest. But behavioral integrity is a competency. It's something that you can learn as an adult. And behavioral integrity is really keeping or honoring your word, not having a gap between what you say and what you do. You may not be able to keep your word, but you can at least honor it. This is something that can be practiced. You honor it by finding someone else to do it. You clean up the mess that came from it. That's called honoring, because you're in a way honoring the spirit of your commitment, if not the actual word. And yes, what is special, as Manju pointed out, special hobbies. And if you can do this, research suggests that you can at least double your performance as a leader. In fact, you can go up to 500%. This is research done by Professor Michael Jensen at the Harvard Business School. He was the one who did the research that led to stock options, pioneered the study of stock options and employee stock options, ESOPs and MSOPs and so on. And it's also true that these kinds of competencies improve the performance of the firm. There's some good work by Raj Sisodia and others, Jack Sheth, on firms of endearment. These kinds of competencies actually improve the performance of the organization as a whole. In the first 3 years may not be so. They're comparable to what are called the good to great companies that were studied in the 1990s and the S&P 500. But 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, they begin to outperform because they create long-lasting partnerships. They create trustworthy, reliable partnerships with all your stakeholders, suppliers, customers, investors, bondholders, the government, and so on. So you create, and employees most especially, you create long-lasting partnerships. And that kind of trust and reliability that you provide leads to better financial performance. So really, this is the way to develop those leadership competencies. Self-awareness is where you begin with, and self-awareness can be acquired or developed by making the effort to understand yourself, getting feedback from others, listening, developing a listening skill, and maintaining a journal. That's something that you can do every day. It requires self-discipline, but if you can do so, maintaining a journal tells you a lot about yourself. Any questions? With that, I want to end and just focus on the journey. So in this 40 minutes or 50 minutes, I described to you what beingfulness is about, drawing from ancient wisdom, what beingful leadership is about, what those different ways of orienting to the world are, those beliefs that make a difference, and these competencies and behaviors that make a difference. Many of these questions were there in the survey. You'll have a better way to understand and measure them by looking at the survey. Any questions? Let me take some questions for the next 5 minutes and then give you a breakout session where you can network. I'm happy to take any questions you may have. Ami, go ahead, please.
Professor, so would it be safe to say that if we are a mindful leader, or if we are a constrained leader, you can be only one type of leader at any given point of time in your life?
No, so I would say that we have the ability to expand our consciousness and to go beyond that. Of course, it's the effort we put in, the experiences we have. But yeah, you don't, I mean, you can switch between a leader who emphasizes that higher part, but in certain occasions, you may need to be extremely about yourself. In fact, I have a story that I often give to people who read about this, where I was on a trek and I almost lost my life. And when it came down to that, I had to switch from being that kind of thinking of the team as a whole to protecting my life. So I became highly constrained, and that's how I survived. So yes, some occasions may demand that you have to take care of yourself. It's like being in a plane where you first take care of yourself, then you can take care of your children. So the flexibility is also switching between these modes is also a part of beingful leadership, right? Does that answer your question?
As you Yes. So as you progress, as you mature, as you get more experience, but in that one given point of time, it's not that as if you can change your constraint versus expanded self with stakeholders. Like if you're dealing with juniors, you're one sort of a leader. If you're dealing with seniors, you're a different kind of leader. That cannot happen in any given one point of time, right?
Yeah, so you could argue that a
you're
point
either
of time
expanded
doesn't
or you're
exist.
either
So rather than think in points of time, let's think in terms of interactions, right? Which takes some amount of time. So you may start, for example, you're working with someone, a stakeholder, a team member, your boss, a supplier, a customer, and you're taking this approach of being non-zero sum, expanded self. It may be that the other person doesn't reciprocate at all, doesn't care, has other motives, out to sabotage you. Then, in this first case, your trust, but you're seeing that there's no reciprocation on the other side. Then you switch to this in that next set of interactions. So the flexibility of having a range of interactions is very important. You're not just doing this over and over. Then you'll be taken advantage of. So really, what is consciousness? Expanded consciousness gives us more flexibility in how we respond to situations. And rather than think in terms of moments of time, think in terms of a set of interactions, right? Okay, Chaitanya, go ahead, please.
So, Professor, just to the point that you made, that many a times in our lives, we have to change the locus of focus from someone else to ourselves. When we think of this whole beingful leader, while organizations are interested in leadership development and building pools of leaders, so on and so forth, beingful leadership is all about me, myself at the end of it, because as we are realizing, our lives are not around our jobs, and our jobs are not the be all and end all. In such a situation, when we think about leadership development, and we think about being beingful leaders, how should we get organizations to understand the importance of them being the catalyst of making this change happen?
Right. Yes. And, Chada, the answer to the question is many things. You were pointing towards work-life balance, work-life integration as an important part, right? That is an important part that you are ensuring, organizations ensure. And I think the way to do it is to show the successful examples. I don't know if any of you have worked in Microsoft or know people who work in Microsoft. You could argue that Microsoft since 2014, after Satya Nadella took over, and I really think of him as a beingful leader, has transformed itself. It's become much more innovative, right? It's not compromised on its performance. It's become much more innovative. It's much more, the market valuation of Microsoft has almost tripled. It's, as you saw from the ChatGPT example, the OpenAI example, it's made investments that are now at some level scaring Google, which was the leader in AI. And Google called a red alert on this. So it's forward-looking, it's innovative, its performance has gone up, its employees are doing very well, but the employees are not being worked to death. Employees have work-life balance and so on. So it's a good example of a company that has succeeded. There are other examples. Unilever under Paul Pullman, and also continuing now. The Tatas for a long time have espoused this. Of course, there's variation how they implement it. And, Azim Premji at some level at Wipro, Infosys in the early years, many healthcare organizations, LV Prasad Institute, there are a number of them, Arvind Eye Care. So many organizations are leading. Patagonia is another example. So these are organizations that are leading the way. They're not many, but they do show that it is possible. It's doable. And the more such examples, the more people will recognize it's doable. Change will happen, but it happens slowly. Okay. With that, let me just quickly, very much, there are many global practice it versus many who don't. How does one propagate this across all levels? I think just by sheer persistence. You propagate it by hammering and hammering away and hammering away. Just keep at it and keep at it. And then things change. I mean, every change has been that way, right? Everything seemed impossible, and then suddenly it seems possible. But it requires tremendous persistence, not just by individuals, but groups. So really, real belief in it. It happens by really believing in it. And at some level, letting go of the outcomes, doing it for its own sake. Before every major change, whatever transformation, whether it's civil rights, women's rights, it has taken many years. Many failed, but eventually it happened. With that, thank you all very much. There's a lot more to this. Unfortunately, I couldn't spend time on it. Thank you all very much for it. And I appreciate your time and effort in being here. Thank you very much. Let me turn it over
Thank you,
to
Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me turn it over to, is it Prashant or Lopamudra?
Prof. Lopa, I'll take
Okay, Lopa, go ahead. Lopa, go ahead, please.
Sure, Prof. Thank you, sir.
Again, thank you all very much.
Thank you, all of you, for hanging in. We sincerely thank you, Professor, for the interesting and insightful session on leadership in the VUCA-BANI world. I'm sure our participants have gathered effective takeaways from the same. I would now request all of you to turn your cameras on for a quick screen grab. After the screen grab, we would quickly move on to the networking sessions, to the breakout rooms for networking. So kindly turn your cameras on for a quick screen grab. Thank you once again. I'll request Ashok to quickly break us into our different networking rooms, where the idea is essentially to network with your co-participants and peers and connect with each other. So yeah, feel free to talk and network with each one of you.